Wonderful. Well, good afternoon. It's great to be here with you all, and Ali, thank you very much for moderating, and thank you to the Mile Institute for this kind invitation to be with you. So, I'm going to try and be brief and to the point and very practical this afternoon, and I believe that we'll have an opportunity at the end. Perhaps I will speak for 30 minutes or so, and then we'll have a chance for questions and answers moderated by Ali. And my understanding also is that Ali and his organization may be obtaining copies of the book that I'll be referring to, which they can then provide to you on a complimentary basis. So the idea today is to provide you with the most helpful information possible and to provide it for you at minimal cost. So let me proceed. So the purpose of today is to talk about executive coaching, and the principal resource that we'll be speaking from is a book that was first released a couple of years ago, called Pinpointing Excellence. It's become popular, I think, because of the current state of the executive coaching industry, and I'll say more about that in a second. But basically, the executive coaching industry is unregulated. That is to say, virtually anyone can now call themselves an executive coach, and they can do that without having any particular education, training, or other qualifications. So for people who need and are interested in obtaining high-quality executive coaching, it's a marketplace that could be described as sort of buyer beware. The Harvard Business Review has referred to the executive coaching marketplace as the Wild West of executive coaching. So the point of this discussion is to provide guidance on how to be most selective, most discriminating, most careful, most shrewd, to get the absolute best quality executive coaching for the time and money that you would be investing in. So let's proceed. In any business situation, as we all know, one of the things we want to do is to manage and minimize risk and uncertainty. And one way of doing that, I think we're all familiar with this, are applying best management practices in, for example, areas like recognizing and assessing business opportunities, building good business plans, attracting financing, addressing legal and intellectual property issues. These are just examples, and creating value. Likewise, one way of minimizing uncertainty, minimizing risk, and maximizing positive outcomes is getting top quality advice and support. One way of doing that may be familiar to many of you is mentoring, and we won't be talking about mentoring per se today, but mentoring is an excellent way of doing that. What we will be talking about in more detail is coaching, executive coaching in particular for people in the business sector. So the real question we'll be addressing today is how to minimize uncertainty in selecting and using executive coaches. So we'll be sharing some ideas about executive coaching. We'll discuss what it is, how it's evolved over the past 30 to 40 years, and then we'll talk again much more in detail about selecting coaches to make sure that you get the highest return on the dollars that you invest and the best possible results from coaching. Okay, so one question people often ask me is, gee, what is executive coaching? And In fact, there is no one particular definition. There are part of the I would say problem and difficulty in executive coaching is that there are literally dozens of different definitions of what executive coaching is. So to start with, let me offer perhaps one of the clearer and more solid definitions of executive coaching, so we have a starting place that is in common. So executive coaching is a formal engagement, formal consulting engagement in which a qualified coach, and we underscore the idea of qualified because, as we'll talk about in a second, qualifications of coaches in the marketplace vary tremendously. There's an enormous variation in quality, and therefore the consumer needs to be very discriminating, as I've said earlier. So the coach should be working with a business leader, entrepreneur, in a series of confidential sessions to meet and achieve clear goals resulting in improved business effectiveness for both the individual and for the individual's business. So that's a good generic description of executive coaching. How long has executive coaching been in existence? Again, there's a little bit of debate about that, but certainly most people would say anywhere from 30 to 35 years ago is roughly when it came into existence. How big is the current marketplace for executive coaching? And the most recent research our firm has is that in U.S. dollars, the executive coaching marketplace is already approaching $3 billion annually. So it is a completely unregulated and rather large marketplace. What that means is that people like you and me are spending a large amount of money on executive coaching, often without understanding how to pick and how to get the best quality in that marketplace. Hence the book and the reason for the book's popularity. Here's the key point, perhaps underscoring this entire discussion. So what is currently required to be a coach? You know, to be a physician or to be an attorney or to be an engineer or to be an IT professional, we could go on and on with different examples. You need specific educational credentials, you need specific experience, you need continuing education often to be licensed and certified to maintain your expertise. In the area of executive coaching, the truth is that nothing is required right now. There is no set of minimum standards that have been established for executive coaches. That obviously creates a situation like the following. We now have an estimated 50,000 or more people who are in the marketplace calling themselves executive coaches. 50,000 plus, and that number is going up rapidly. Why is that a problem? Well, because anybody, literally anybody, can decide to jump into the executive coaching marketplace, and unless you know how to differentiate highly qualified coaches from those with lesser qualifications, you could end up selecting and using a coach and having outcomes that are poor to disastrous. So are there any quality control measures in the marketplace to ensure high quality service? Not really. There are very few. What kind of consumer protection is available to us if we are thinking about getting an executive coach? Really, not much of anything. That is why this book has been designed to equip consumers to be as careful and discriminating as possible in their own selection of coaches. Is the marketplace confusing? Yes, the marketplace of coaches is very confusing, because imagine all 50,000 plus executive coaches globally being out there pitching their services. Every coach that is in the marketplace, of course, needs to have a value proposition or a means of pitching their services so that they can convince you to use them as a coach. That creates, with 50,000 different messages coming from different people, it creates a lot of confusion for consumers. And again, that seems to be why the book I referred to is popular. And there'll be a second edition of the book coming out next year. So why do people use executive coaching? Just to speak to that for a second, they often will use executive coaching to build the capabilities of very highly qualified, excellent people who have joined their firms, high potentials, as you might refer to executives in that category. There may be new or existing teams of leaders that could be functioning at a higher level, at a more efficient or better coordinated level. That's another example of where executive coaches can be used. Onboarding key employees coming from different firms might be another area. These are just examples. Sometimes relationships and coordination between a chief executive officer and his or her board of directors could be more effective, better coordinated, more aligned. That's another area. We are often involved in organizational restructuring, mergers and acquisitions, for example. We work with entrepreneurs who are in the middle of launching a new business. That's another area where executive coaching is useful. So these, again, are simply examples. So what happens now? What has been going on for 30 years when it comes time to look for and select a coach? Well, the truth is that many executives, even the most senior executives, will perhaps call one of their colleagues and say something like, gee, have you used an executive coach? If so, who have you used? And let's just say that one executive hears from another executive about using a coach. And perhaps that person will meet with the coach briefly. And let's just say that the coach is charming, interesting to meet with, a good conversationalist, and perhaps someone who's had some experience in working with other firms. That's all perfectly good. Executives then will trust their sort of gut reaction. Do I feel comfortable with this particular coach? And then on that basis alone, often will pick the coach and get started. Now, the problem with that is that gut reactions, while they have some value, are not very thorough, and so lots of mistakes can be made, unfortunately. Lots of money can be wasted. Lots of businesses can entrust their future to coaching advice that comes from people with questionable qualifications. So the odds are actually against consistently and reliably identifying and using top quality executive coaches if you do that, if there is not a systematic way of evaluating them. So again, that's what we'll be talking about in a second. The odds actually favor picking a poor to mediocre coach, and the bottom line impact of getting an excellent coach versus a mediocre to poor coach is huge. And we could spend this entire webinar talking about instances, unfortunately, of mediocre to poor coaches leading businesses in the wrong direction. So rather than doing that, let's let's talk about how not to get into that situation. So what does this situation mean for consumers, for people interested in using an executive coach? Again, I've mentioned that it's confusing because each coach out there has their own pitch and marketing message. There's an enormous amount of risk because it's very difficult for consumers to be assured of high-quality service unless they're very discriminating in the way they pick a coach. It can be frustrating, so instead of having control of the marketplace, consumers often feel like they're the victims in the marketplace. And the main problem is loss, both detected and undetected, loss of money, of time, of energy, of talent management results, of business opportunities, so on and so forth. So what is the solution? And that's really the crux of what we'll talk about today. What is the solution to this problem? Well, as laid out in this book, and the book is, again, designed for consumers, so it is very short. It's 120 pages. It's very practical, executable, and the point is to help consumers set the quality bar very high in looking at prospective coaches, at possible coaches to use. There is a two-step process which we'll talk about. The process incorporates intangible factors, and by intangible factors, I mean things like the interpersonal style of the coach, the emotional makeup of the coach. And it also incorporates tangible factors. Tangible factors can be the level of actual business experience of the coach, the degrees, the academic training and degrees that have been earned by the coach. So easily trackable, tangible factors. The point also of the process is to minimize any bias for tangible versus intangible qualities. So in other words, both are important, and the idea is to balance their importance, to balance and look at both of them, and not to be swayed overly by one or the other. So what is the process? Well, the first step, and this is enumerated in more detail in the book, is to focus first on, as I said, tangible data, tangible information about a prospective coach. So we recommend using 3 categories of candidate information, of tangible candidate information. First, relevant and applied experience. How experienced is the coach in, for example, the supply chain function, or the technology industry, or whatever the setting is for that you, the consumer, happen to be in. So what relevant and applied experience does the coach have in working in, for example, your industry or in business in general? Secondly, what formal training and education does the coach have? If the coach is putting himself forward or herself forward as someone who is helpful in a particular area of business, do they have an MBA, for example? Where have they obtained their MBA? What quality of education do they actually have? Do they have training in psychology? Do they have a PhD in psychology? Are they a licensed psychologist? Where, again, did they get their training? And then thirdly, what are they doing every year, year to year, on an ongoing basis to maintain their knowledge, to maintain their expertise, to maintain their edge, to stay current in the field? So really, 3 tangible areas of candidate data: experience, formal training, and ongoing learning. Okay. Now, In each of those three areas, we would suggest that there be a focus on 4 different areas of knowledge and skill. And let me take a minute to describe each of these. Okay? Again, very straightforward. First of all, for an executive coach, obviously, you'd be surprised, obviously, business is an area where there should be a lot of depth in the executive coach. However, you'd be surprised perhaps to know that the majority of the 50,000 plus people in the marketplace who are talking about themselves as executive coaches have little to no formal education in business. That is a sad but unfortunately true fact. So why is a business background important for an executive coach? Well, it's very important to understand the environment that we are operating in. If we are business people, we need an executive coach who understands the corporate environment or the business environment, and that's why they need business experience and training. It's important for a coach to understand best practices and principles in management. It's important for a coach to understand best practices and principles in leadership. These are just some examples. It's important for a strong executive coach to understand how different business functions can relate and be interdependent. For example, marketing, or finance, or the supply chain function, or the technology function. The list can go on and on. Most executive coaches who are very effective need to understand the role of talent management and best practices in the area of talent management. That is to say, attracting, recruiting, onboarding, developing the right talent for the organization along with succession planning. Okay, so this is, and sometimes it's important for people to understand the differences between public organizations and private businesses because they have different business operations and principles in many cases. So this is just a sample list. Okay, there are many more. So business is important. Secondly, psychology is very important. Why is psychology important as an area of depth and understanding in strong executive coaches? Well, let's just say we are executives and we need a coach. It's very important for that coach to be able to determine and understand why we think and behave the way we do, how we are similar and different from other executives, why we are as complex as we are. So it's very important for executive coaches to be strong and well-versed in psychology. There may be psychological issues that are affecting our performance, for example. We may be anxious. We may be distracted. We may have lots of different issues that a psychologist will be able to detect and address, but if we don't have that training, we don't see those issues, and therefore they aren't addressed, and the outcomes are not as good. We may be thinking in negative or unproductive ways. We may have personality issues that are limiting our effectiveness. So personality issues, for example, narcissism could be something that could be holding us back in terms of our effectiveness. Fears, anxieties, and doubts that we might have could be limiting as well. So psychologists who are fully qualified, licensed, and at the doctoral level are skilled in using assessments, in using psychological assessments, for example, to gauge different leadership styles, problem-solving skills, conflict management preferences, personalities, and a whole range of other characteristics that are very important to understand if you're going to help somebody be more effective. And that, of course, is the whole point of executive coaching. Also, psychologists, for example, in our firm, can use all of the existing information, research that has been done in areas of personality, emotion, and career development, and adult learning, and behavior change, and again, the list goes on and on. But understanding how to use that information and also being able to conduct research and to provide and contribute to that information is very important as well. So, psychology is the second area where there should be considerable depth. The third area, not surprisingly, you would expect that everybody who is out there calling themselves an executive coach would have considerable depth and training in coaching. And I know that's a sort of an obvious comment to make. However, the truth is, if you look carefully and look under the covers, so to speak, most people who are calling themselves executive coaches have minimal, if any, coach training. That, again, is hard to believe, and yet, because anybody can call themselves an executive coach, there are many cases where people don't actually have any training. So it's very important to be getting whatever training is available in coaching, and there are organizations such as the International Coach Federation that provides certification and training, which at a minimum are very important for coaches to have. It's important, obviously, because coaches need to be able to be current in the field. They need to understand different models and theories of coaching. They need to understand the dynamics of executive coaching on the executive's organization, and on coach. They need to stay current with developments in the practice of coaching. They need to be able to distinguish coaching from psychotherapy, counseling, mentoring, and other somewhat similar but not identical practices. Okay, so business psychology and coaching are three areas where there absolutely has to be significant depth in an executive coach. And lastly, in the area of ethics, there needs to be depth. So why are ethics important? Well, and as an example, I operate under two different ethics codes, one from the American Psychological Association as a licensed psychologist, and secondly, as a certified coach, I operate under the ethics code of the International Coach Federation. But the key idea behind having a strong ethical base is that executives who seek executive coaching are vulnerable. They are seeking help to develop further. They are going to be disclosing to the coach issues that they're working on, dependencies that they may have. So areas such as confidentiality are very important. And so operating in an ethical fashion under a strict ethical code is very important. And attorneys and physicians and a variety of other fields, of course, have their own ethics codes that their practitioners abide by, principally to maintain service quality and to provide the best possible consumer protection for people who seek their services. Most people who come for executive coaching help, unfortunately, are limited in their ability to track the quality of the service that they're getting. That is to say, until it dawns on the person that they have not been getting very good service quality, they a lot of time can go by, a lot of money can be spent before it becomes apparent that the selection of the coach could have been more effective. So again, it is a buyer beware marketplace, and so there needs to be a strong ethical underpinning to the practice of coaching, because clients of a coach are dependent on the coach and have a limited ability to track the quality of the service. And clients typically will assume and trust that coaches understand and adhere to a strict code of ethics. And unless, in fact, they do, and unless the client knows to ask that question when they are trying to evaluate a coach, they may get into a situation with somebody who is not operating based on a strict ethical code. And that, of course, is very, very damaging, potentially difficult. Clients also assume that coaches are current in understanding how to apply ethical principles. And again, I mentioned confidentiality is one of them. Okay, so these are the 4 areas that are described in more detail in the book, areas in which you can evaluate the depth and quality of an executive coach in the first phase of this process, in step 1. Okay? And for those people who, in your opinion, are adequately deep in those 4 areas, then you can take those candidates to the second step of the process, which is more focused on intangibles. And we'll talk about this in a second, but for example, in the book there are 50 sample questions that you can use in a conversation with a coach that you might be thinking about, a coach that you might be evaluating, to learn more about the coach's intangible qualities. And those can be, for example, the problem-solving and intellectual power of the coach. Right? Some people are wonderful conversationalists, but actually are not particularly strong in problem-solving. And unfortunately, the whole point of coaching for many people is to help solve problems. And I know that sounds somewhat obvious to say, but again, a large number of people are deficient in this area and won't tell you that. What are the emotional characteristics of this prospective coach? How calm, how mature, how insightful is this person? There are lots of questions you can use to get at that. How self-aware is this person? How well does the person understand how his or her experience in life and in work has affected the way they go about their practice, what their values are, what their priorities are? What is their leadership or work style? How democratic are they? How authoritarian are they? How does that work in relationship to you, the prospective user of coaching? And what kind of interpersonal style or preference does the coach have? How comfortable is the coach to be with? How effective is the coach at putting you at ease and developing trust in the relationship? Again, these are just examples of intangible qualities that are enumerated in more detail in the book. Okay, so if you go through this 2-step process, which is very straightforward, the end result is that you will come out with a much more informed, thorough, and accurate choice of a very high-quality executive coach. You will have gone through a process that integrates specific information about tangibles. Again, for example, depth of experience and depth of education, and also that integrates intangibles, such as what we just talked about. The bottom line, and the reason for the book and the reason for this webinar, is to minimize your decision-making risks so that you end up with the best possible, highest quality service in executive coaching. And the purpose of that, of course, is to maximize the return on your investment of money and time and opportunity costs and the like, so that you are as successful as possible and that you meet your goals. So I hope also that in going through this, you will share what you learn, share best practices to further sharpen the way you evaluate and select coaches, so that over time you become more and more discriminating and wise and perceptive about picking coaches so that you get the highest possible value for yourself and for your firm or business. So again, our approach today was to discuss a little bit about what coaching is, how it is in sort of a widely unregulated marketplace, how it's evolved, and therefore how to select coaches to ensure that you get the best possible service. And again, as a resource, the book is called Pinpointing Excellence. It's available in digital form, and again, I think Ali and his firm, Mile, may be in position to have copies of the book, hard copies of the book, available on a complimentary basis to provide for those of you listening today. But that again, is something you can talk with Mile about. So our goal, again, is to provide practical, straightforward support to arm consumers of coaching to be as selective as possible, to be sure that they evaluate and select only top quality executive coaches. And also, this book seems to be popular with executive coaches who want to use it as a guide to their own professional development. So if you happen to be a coach and you want to become stronger in the field and in the marketplace, the book seems to be a useful resource for that. So I wish all of you continued success. I've been happy to be with you, and I think, Ali, if we can at this point, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that have come in from people. And again, I hope this is very helpful. And please feel free to use that email as a place if you have specific questions for me. I'm happy to respond directly to them in any way that can be helpful. Okay?
Well, thank you very much, Doctor, for a very intriguing presentation. We are open for the Q&A, folks, now. You could either raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your webinar console, so I can give you a chance to speak to Dr. John directly if you raise your hand, or you could put your questions in the question box. I see there are a few questions now already in the question box, so let me go ahead and start selecting one by one. Just a second. There's a question, Doctor, should hiring of coaches be left on HR, or more or less executives should hire them through their own reference points based on their own needs?
It's a very good question, and of course, sometimes the executive coaching evaluation process is entrusted to HR professionals. So I think the answer is in either case, or in both cases, whether it's the executive himself or herself, or if it's the human resources department on behalf of the executive, in either case, it's very important for this discipline process to be used. So I'd say it's more important that the process be used to ensure quality than it is whether that is done by the executive or by the HR department, because I see both. both HR people, HR professionals, and the executive himself or herself can be actively involved and very importantly involved in the selection process. So I hope that's a helpful answer.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let me move to the next question. On a personal level, how should we secure our agreement with the coach on a clause of confidentiality, which should not necessarily land the gaps to other departments?
So,
or
that's a very good one of the first questions that we ask when we're invited in as, for example, as a coach, is to learn who the client is. So, for example, if a large company hires us to work with a particular individual, one of the first questions ethically to ask is, who is the client? And what I mean by that is, if the client is the corporation itself, does that mean that the discussions that I have as a coach with the individual executive who works at that company, are those conversations confidential, or should I be expected to tell or describe to the company, for example, to the HR department, what the client and I are talking about? So I usually want to be careful to establish who the client is. Is it the individual person that we're working with? In which case, the conversations that we have with that person are held in confidence, or is the client the corporation itself? And in cases like that, the corporation can ask for summaries or can ask to be kept aware of what we are talking about in coaching sessions. And sometimes when that is happening, the person in the coaching session will be more reserved and less inclined to be completely open and honest about areas that they want to discuss. So I hope I'm answering the question. It's very important to determine at the beginning of the coaching engagement who the actual coaching client is, the company or the individual who works for the company.
Okay, thank you. There's another interesting question. In your experience, what are the main reasons for CEOs who refuse to work with executive coaches? From HR perspective, how should one convince them to hire a coach?
Well, some CEOs are correctly hesitant to work with an executive coach because perhaps they may have either heard of or had bad experiences with an executive coach because, again, they unfortunately did not know how to, with a lot of discrimination and care, pick the right executive coach. So that is the first thing that often comes up when there's a CEO that's hesitant about using an executive coach. They're not convinced about the value that they will receive because they are not convinced that they are getting a person with high qualifications. Secondly, many CEOs are concerned about confidentiality. Many of the CEOs that I work with, for example, view me as a confidant and as a sounding board, as a problem-solving partner, and it's very important to them that confidentiality is maintained, and it's very important to them that that this work take place under a formal ethical code so that they can be assured of confidentiality. So most CEOs are very limited in who they can speak with and who they can get help from, and who they can let their guard down with. And that's a very important function that an executive coach can serve. But again, from the CEO's point of view, they won't proceed in that direction unless they are very sure about the level of expertise of the coach, as we've said, the level of depth the coach has in business and psychology and the like, and also the ethical practices of the coach. So I would, if I were an HR person trying to propose coaching for a CEO, I would talk about the importance of those factors.
Okay, thank you. Another interesting question. Should coaches be allowed to mingle in our personal lives to learn more about ourselves? How can we keep a balance in opening up, ensuring our privacy is not breached?
Well, that's an excellent question. Again, coaches who are operating under formal ethics codes understand that they are not to disclose anything that they hear in coaching sessions, with the possible exception of, and I make this point clear, if I am working with somebody and it becomes apparent to me that they have some psychological stressors that are more personal than business related. For example, they may have family dynamics that are difficult to deal with. Then part of my ethical responsibility as a coach is to help them find clinical support, counseling support to help them deal with and work with those personal issues. So it's important, if you're an executive coach, to understand the limits of your training. If you are not fully trained as a clinical psychologist, then you should not be dealing with clinical issues. You should be helping your client find the clinical support that they need to deal with those issues. So it's important to have a good set of boundaries and to make sure that the client is getting the resources that he or she needs from you as an executive coach, but if necessary, also from another person in the community who might be clinically qualified.
I think we can take two more questions. So let me move and pick one. Evidently, executive coaches at times fail to transfer the required skills back to the work for their clients. Do you think it is because of the lack of clarity through process-based approach, or what are the other reasons for any such failure?
Very, very good question. I think that any highly skilled coach will have a well-established process that she or he uses in working with clients. For example, the process that we use is typically to begin the coaching engagement by developing trust, and then often we will use psychological assessments to learn about the person and about their characteristics. We'll interview the person extensively to learn about, again, about their personal characteristics and to learn about what their priorities are in coaching. And then we systematically begin to work towards each of those goals in the coaching sessions. But I think the question was, what processes should the prospective client look for in coaches, and the simple answer is that the coach should be able to describe in detail, convincingly, and specifically what process is going to be used if they are selected as a coach. And the consumer needs to be to trust their instinct about whether this sounds like it's a cohesive, professional, well-grounded approach and process or not. And any coach that cannot describe the process that they use succinctly and thoroughly, I think that's an early indicator that you're not talking with the right coach.
Just one last question, sir. On hiring and evaluating the performance of coaches, is it recommended to look around and hire an individual coach from an open market, or rather work with an organization which offers the services of executive coaching?
That's a good question. Well, there are organizations that of any size that offer executive coaching, anything from an individual practitioner to a very large organization. Unfortunately, the reason why the process that we've just talked about in this webinar is important is that sometimes an organization, let's say a large organization that offers executive coaching, can put a coach in front of you who actually is not particularly well qualified. But what the person will say is, well, I don't particularly have this kind of training or that kind of training or this kind of training or that kind of training. However, I have all the training that I need because I've received it here at the ABC company, right? So sometimes large organizations can put forward very young or inexperienced or only partially trained people as coaches, and they can be presented under the banner of the ABC company without actually having, on an individual level, the various strengths that we have talked about. So to answer the question, I think it is less important whether the person that you're using as a coach comes from an organization of 5 people or 5,000 people. It's much more important that the person you're considering using meets all the requirements that we just talked about. I hope that answers that question.
I certainly hope so, and that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank you, Dr. Reed, for your time and giving this presentation in a very interactive manner. Any concluding remarks that you would like to give, Doctor?
Thank you all for your time. I hope you will pass the word along to your friends and colleagues about the importance of being very shrewd and discriminating in selecting executive coaches. I hope that, for example, this book may be of help to you. I'm not here to sell the book. I'm very often in the position of being able to give away copies, and they're available at a minimal cost through digital means and also in hard copy. I'm most interested in helping the executive coaching field raise its quality standards, and the only way that will happen is by consumers like you insisting on top quality. Executive coaching as an industry will not in my lifetime will it be able to police itself and organize itself. So consumers need to be the people who drive the improvement in coaching quality by the selections of coaches that they make. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope it's been helpful. And again, either through the email or through the text, information on this slide. If you have specific questions, I'll get to them as quickly as possible. I'd be happy to be of help. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much once again, Doctor, and all of those who participated. Really appreciate your time also, and for asking excellent questions and making an interactive experience for all of us. I have broadcasted the link through the chat box on the webinar console, from where you can download the soft copy of the presentation which Dr. Reed just gave in this webinar. We are recording this webinar and shall upload it on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So please stay tuned to Mile Community for the recorded versions and for our upcoming webinars. Once again, Dr. Reed, thank you very much, and thank you all of those who participated. With that note, I would like to end the webinar, and you all will be automatically dismissed out. Have a good day, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you